On the freezing morning of October 30, 1944, in the Vosges Mountains of France, a Japanese-American soldier named Matsumoto emerged from the dense forest and offered a cigarette to a trapped Texas National Guardsman who hadn't seen friendly forces in 6 days. The Texan, Ed Guy, later recalled, "I might have hugged him, I don't know. I was just excited to get out of there." Behind Sakamoto came the remnants of what had been 3 full battalions, now reduced to a few hundred bloodied, exhausted men who had just fought through the worst combat of their lives to save 211 Texans they'd never met. Company I had started the rescue with 185 men. Only 8 walked out unhurt. Company K began with 186 men. Only 17 remained standing. In 5 days of hell, these soldiers had suffered over 800 casualties, more than 3 times the number of men they rescued, to break through German defenses that had repelled every previous attempt. Here's what makes this story almost unbearable in its irony. While these soldiers were bleeding and dying in a French forest, their families, their parents, siblings, wives, and children were imprisoned behind barbed wire in American concentration camps, guilty of nothing except having Japanese faces. These young men of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team were fighting for a country that had taken everything from them, stripped them of their homes and businesses, declared them enemy aliens, and locked their loved ones away in horse stalls and tar paper barracks in remote deserts. When recruiters came to these camps asking for volunteers, many families tore apart over the question, how could you fight for a nation that treated you like criminals? Yet more than 18,000 Japanese Americans answered the call, and they didn't just serve, they became the most decorated unit for its size and length of service in the entire history of the United States military, earning over 18,000 awards, including 21 Medals of Honor, 52 Distinguished Service Crosses, 560 Silver Stars, and more than 4,000 Purple Hearts. Their motto was "Go for broke," a gambling term meaning to risk everything on one great effort to win big. They had to win big because they weren't just fighting Germans. They were fighting to prove their loyalty to a country that doubted them, fighting for the families imprisoned at home, fighting against the racism that called them Japs and enemy aliens, fighting for the right to simply be seen as Americans. And they paid for that recognition in blood, sacrifice, and a courage so profound that even their enemies respected them, even as their own countrymen questioned their loyalty. If stories of courage in the face of injustice inspire you, subscribe and tell us in the comments which unsung heroes of World War II we should honor next. The story of the 442nd begins not on European battlefields, but on a quiet Sunday morning in Hawaii. On December 7, 1941, when Japanese carrier planes attacked Pearl Harbor, they didn't just sink American battleships, they fundamentally changed how America viewed its own citizens. Within hours of the attack, FBI agents began rounding up Japanese American community leaders across the West Coast. Buddhist priests, Japanese language teachers, newspaper editors, business owners, anyone with connections to Japan was suspect. Shortly after Pearl Harbor, Japanese American men were initially categorized as 4C, enemy alien, and therefore not subject to the draft. On February 19, 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, effectively placing over 100,000 West Coast residents of Japanese descent, the majority of them American citizens, into incarceration camps. Families were given as little as 48 hours to report to assembly centers, often county fairgrounds or racetracks, where they were housed in converted horse stalls. They could bring only what they could carry: homes, businesses, farms, cultivated for generations, All had to be sold for pennies on the dollar or simply abandoned. Many Japanese Americans never recovered financially. Racism against Japanese Americans was rampant as much of the country grew more fearful and suspicious of collaboration with the Japanese government. Newspapers printed cartoons depicting Japanese Americans as spies and saboteurs. Signs appeared in shop windows, "No Japs allowed." The irony was crushing. Japanese Americans were equally outraged at the attack on their country, yet they were the ones imprisoned. From the assembly centers, families were transported to 10 permanent camps in remote, desolate locations: Manzanar and Tule Lake in California, Poston and Gila River in Arizona, Hart Mountain in Wyoming, Minidoka in Idaho, Topaz in Utah, Amach in Colorado, Jerome and Roar in Arkansas. These weren't pleasant relocation centers. They were prison camps surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers where armed sentries had orders to shoot anyone who tried to leave. The conditions were harsh. Families lived in cramped barracks with no privacy, only thin walls separating them from neighbors. Summers were brutally hot, winters freezing. Dust storms swept through the camps, coating everything. Yet somehow, imprisoned Americans tried to maintain normalcy. Children attended makeshift schools. Adults took whatever jobs were available. Families planted gardens in the barren soil. It was into these camps in early 1943 that military recruiters arrived with an extraordinary request. Who wants to volunteer to fight for America? The order, dated January 22, 1943, directed that a Japanese-American combat team should be activated. President Roosevelt announced the formation of the 442nd Infantry Regimental Combat Team on February 1, 1943, saying, "Americanism is not, and never was, a matter of race or ancestry." The response split families and communities. The U.S. Army called for 1,500 volunteers from Hawaii and 3,000 from the mainland. An overwhelming 10,000 men from Hawaii volunteered. In Hawaii, where Japanese Americans made up a large percentage of the population and had not been mass incarcerated, young Nisei men rushed to recruiting stations. The response on the United States mainland was less spectacular. While there were internment camps in Hawaii and many people of Japanese descent were jailed, there were no massive relocation or incarceration attempts like those on the mainland. The mass relocation of the Japanese Americans on the mainland led to fear and mistrust. When the War Department set a goal of 3,000 recruits from the mainland, about 1,200 volunteered. For mainland Japanese Americans, the decision was agonizing. Parents who had lost everything asked, "Why should our sons fight for a country that treats us like enemies?" Some young men refused on principle. How could they defend democracy while their families lived behind barbed wire? Others saw military service as the only way to prove their loyalty and reclaim their rights as Americans. Only 1,256 volunteered from the mainland during this initial call for volunteers. As a result, around 3,000 men from Hawaii and 800 men from the mainland were inducted. Ultimately, the draft was reinstated to obtain more Japanese Americans from the mainland to become part of the 10,000 men who eventually served in the 100th Infantry Battalion and 442nd Regiment. The motto they chose defined their mission: "Go for broke," a gambling term that means risking everything on one great effort to win big. These Nisei soldiers understood they had to be better than everyone else, braver than everyone else, more loyal than everyone else. Anything less than exceptional performance would condemn all Japanese Americans as disloyal. With the 442nd Regimental Combat Team activated on February 1, 1943, approximately 4,000 accepted volunteers ended up in Camp Shelby, Mississippi for training. When the Hawaiian Nisei and mainland Nisei met at Camp Shelby, tensions immediately erupted. The islanders and mainlanders arrived for training at Camp Shelby, Mississippi in April 1943. Immediately, they fought with each other because of different perspectives based on where they grew up. The Hawaiians, who made up roughly two-thirds of the regiment, came from a place where Japanese Americans were a significant part of the community. They had experienced discrimination, but not imprisonment. Many were easygoing, spoke pidgin English, and couldn't understand why the mainland Nisei seemed so angry and intense. The mainland Nisei, having just left concentration camps, were bitter. They had lost their homes, their businesses, their freedom. Many had families still behind barbed wire. When carefree Hawaiians made jokes or seemed not to take things seriously, mainlanders saw it as disrespect for the sacrifice they were making. Fistfights broke out. The groups refused to socialize. Officers worried the unit would never coalesce into an effective fighting force. Then something changed. Mainland Nisei began inviting Hawaiians to visit their families, still imprisoned in camps. When Hawaiian soldiers saw the conditions their fellow Nisei endured, when they saw children playing in the dust behind barbed wire, when they met parents who had lost everything, they understood. The divide began to heal. They realized they were all fighting the same battle, to prove that being Japanese American didn't make them less American. By the time they completed training and shipped out to Europe in May 1944, they had become brothers.
The 100th Infantry Battalion, separate, the 1 Puka Puka, had already been fighting in Italy since September 1943. This all-Hawaiian unit had earned a fierce reputation. After a year of individual and unit training at Camp Shelby, Mississippi, the unit deployed to the Mediterranean in May 1944. The 442nd joined them in June 1944, landing at Anzio just after the Allies captured Rome. They immediately went into heavy combat. Southern France in summer 1944 was brutal. Mountainous terrain, entrenched German positions, constant artillery fire. The Nisei soldiers quickly proved themselves under fire. Their first major test came in the liberation of several French towns. The men liberated the towns of Bruyères, Belmont, and Bifontaine, whose inhabitants continued to honor the 442 with monuments, museums, and streets named in their honor. By October 1944, the 442nd had been fighting nearly continuously. As the soldiers of the 36th Infantry Division, including the 100th 442 RCT, pushed toward Germany in late 1944, they faced some of their heaviest resistance and harshest terrain in the Vosges Mountains of eastern France. Then came the order that would define their legacy.
Just a few miles from them, the enemy had trapped and surrounded another group of soldiers, the 141st Infantry Regiment, called the Lost Battalion. Isolated and cut off by the enemy, the 442nd was sent to rescue them. Deep in the forest, the 1st Battalion, 141st Regiment of the 36th Texas Division was surrounded by German troops and running out of food and ammunition. Major General John Dahlquist was the much reviled commander of the division. Over 200 men of this lost battalion had been sent ahead of logistical support and were surrounded by German troops, dug in and fortified. Dahlquist had a trapped unit that needed rescuing, the 141st Regiment, which had been ordered to advance 4 miles beyond friendly forces. The soldiers warned that they would get cut off, but they pushed on as ordered. The Germans quickly surrounded them on 3 sides. In fact, 6,000 fresh German troops moved into the area, ordered to hold their positions at any cost. No surrender, no retreat. More than 270 members of the 141st's 1st Battalion, later dubbed the Lost Battalion, were stranded on a ridge near Saint-Dié. 2 attempts by other units to rescue the Texans had failed. Dahlquist ordered the 442nd to enter the Vosges Mountains to attempt a rescue after 2 attempts by other units had failed. The 442nd had just finished 9 straight days of combat. They were supposed to have 5 days of rest. The men were supposed to have 5 days of well-deserved and much-needed rest. A time to, as Fred Shiosaki bluntly put it, no longer worry about this guy gonna take a shot at you, or artillery shells gonna land or something. But that rest would be short-lived. On October 25, 1944, they were ordered back into action.
In the early pre-dawn hours of October 25, 1944, the 442nd set out to reach the lost battalion. They trudged through miles of heavily mined fields and steep ravines in the mud and icy rain, each holding on to the man ahead of him because the fog was too thick to see more than a few feet ahead. As one soldier later recalled, it was blacker than the inside of a wolf. Over the next 6 days, the Nisei soldiers of the 442nd and the attached 522nd Field Artillery Battalion attempted to break through the entrenched German lines. They were outnumbered 4-1 at times, the lines so close together that the Nisei had to jump into trenches to avoid their own artillery fire. PVT George Sakato reported that the lines were often so close that when the American artillery was active, we jumped into any hole that was open to keep from getting hit. The terrain was unforgiving. The weather was brutal. Freezing rain, mud, fog so thick visibility was measured in feet. As bone-chilling rain settled over the region, the Nisei arrived still kitted in their summer-issue uniforms. Many soldiers weren't properly equipped for the cold. They pushed forward anyway. In 5 days of battle, from 26 to 30 October 1944, the 442nd broke through German defenses and rescued 211 men. The 442nd suffered over 800 casualties. Company I went in with 185 men. 8 came out unhurt. Company K engaged the enemy with 186 men. 169 were wounded or killed. Following the strenuous hand-to-hand combat of October 29 and an artillery bombardment the morning of October 30, the battles finally eased for the 100th 442nd RCT. But the situation was still tense for the trapped Texans. Finally, on October 30, the breakthrough came. By mid-afternoon, the Nisei were able to penetrate the German lines and caught sight of soldiers in American uniforms. In what has become a famous exchange, Mut Sakamoto, the first Japanese-American to reach the trapped soldiers, offered a cigarette to the men of the 36th when he found them. Ed Guy, one of the rescued soldiers, recalled, "I might have hugged Mut Sakamoto. I don't know. I was just excited to get out of there." Major Claude D. Roscoe of the 141st Regiment remembered the moment when they finally realized who their heroes were. To our great pleasure, it was members of the 442nd Combat Team. We were overjoyed to see these people, for we knew them as the best fighting men in the ETO. After 5 days of horrific combat, the Texans were rescued by the Japanese Americans. The 442nd suffered casualties several times the number of men they had rescued. The Nisei had saved 211 Texans at the cost of over 800 of their own. But General Dahlquist wasn't done with them, but there would be no time to mourn their dead. Despite its depleted ranks and the exhaustion of those still barely standing, the men were ordered to continue marching along the ridges to another town. For 9 more days, the decimated 442nd continued fighting, securing more territory. It was another 9 days before they were finally allowed to rest, a total of more than 3 weeks of almost non-stop combat for the entire Vosges campaign, costing approximately 150 deaths and over 1,800 wounded. Then came the moment that epitomized everything wrong with how the Nisei had been treated. On November 12, in Bruyères, General Dahlquist called for a full review of the 100th 442nd to thank them for their efforts. Seeing so few men, he asked his officers for an explanation, and was told these soldiers were the only ones left. General Dahlquist asked the 442nd to pass in review. He asked, "Where are all the men?" "Sorry, sir, this is all we have left," replied a teary-eyed officer. After days of near constant fighting, the 442nd had suffered roughly 1,000 casualties. 200 soldiers were killed in action or missing, with over 800 seriously wounded. The general had expected to see thousands. Instead, a few hundred exhausted, wounded men stood before him. That was all that remained.
Today, the 442nd is remembered as the most decorated unit for its size and length of service in the history of the U.S. military. The unit, totaling about 18,000 men, received over 4,000 Purple Hearts, 4,000 Bronze Stars, 560 Silver Star Medals, 21 Medals of Honor, and 7 Presidential Unit citations. But recognition came slowly and incompletely. Recommendations for the Congressional Medal of Honor were submitted to recognize 5 soldiers for their heroic actions in the Vosges campaign. All were denied. 4 were downgraded to Distinguished Service Crosses, and 1 to a grade lower, the Silver Star. It wasn't until the year 2000, 56 years after the battle, that 3 members of the 442nd, decorated for valor for their participation in the rescue, Barney Hajiro, James Okubo, and George Sakato, were originally awarded lesser medals. In 2000, they were upgraded to the Medal of Honor, with Okubo, who died in 1967, receiving his medal posthumously. In 1962, Texas Governor John Connally made the veterans of the 442nd honorary Texans for their role in the rescue of the lost battalion. It was a touching gesture, but it couldn't change what these men had endured. In 2010, the 442nd received the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian award in the United States. By then, most of the original members had passed away. The men of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team did more than fight for America. Despite the years of suspicion and racism that prevailed at home, these Nisei men fought for their country and their ideals of freedom and democracy. They fought to prove that American identity isn't about race or ancestry. It's about values, courage, and sacrifice. Their service didn't immediately end discrimination. Many 442nd veterans returned home to find "No Japs Allowed" signs still in windows, to communities that refused to welcome them back. Some couldn't reclaim property stolen while they were imprisoned. The racism didn't vanish overnight, but they had proven something that could never be taken away. When America called, Japanese Americans answered. When given impossible missions, they succeeded. When told they weren't real Americans, they bled red, white, and blue. The 442nd's motto, "Go for broke," meant risking everything to win big. They risked everything: their lives, their family's safety, their dignity. And they won something profound. They proved that loyalty isn't about appearance or ancestry. It's about standing up for your country, even when your country hasn't stood up for you. That lesson echoes through American history, a testament to the courage of young men who fought 2 wars at once, one against fascism abroad and one against racism at home. They won both.